He stood alone, shoulders hunched against the downpour. No umbrella, no coat, just a faded cap pulled low over his eyes and a small bouquet of white roses clutched in one trembling hand. Cars splashed past, their drivers glancing but never slowing. The memorial steps behind him were empty. Not a soul stood beside him. But 22 minutes later, the sound of synchronized boots on wet pavement cut through the rain. One by one, they emerged from the mist, an entire formation, marching in silence, every head bowed. The rain didn't seem to bother him, though it had already soaked through his jacket and seeped into his boots. Water dripped from the brim of his cap in steady rivulets, blurring the faint stitching of a name almost worn away. His shoulders curved forward, but not in defeat, more like a man carrying something heavy that couldn't be set down. In his right hand, the bouquet of white roses trembled, each petal collecting beads of rain until they began to fall, one drop at a time. A teenage boy passed with a hood pulled tight over his head. He slowed for half a second, as if to ask something, then thought better of it and kept walking. Behind the old man, the memorial stood cold and indifferent, a wall of names etched into dark granite. Names that would outlast every person who came to see them. Somewhere a horn honked. The world was still moving, still rushing, still late for something. But he wasn't moving at all. It was as if the rain had rooted him in place. A woman under a large red umbrella crossed the street, glanced at him once, then twice, and finally away. She had no way of knowing this was the 32nd year he had come here, rain or shine, on this exact day. He looked down at the roses, then back up at the wall, his lips moving with words only the rain could hear. And still, no one stood with him. Not yet. His name was Samuel Holt, though almost no one used it anymore. To the neighbors in his small apartment building, he was simply the old man on the 3rd floor. To the cashier at the grocery store, he was Sir or Buddy, if the line was long and her patience was short. But to a handful of men scattered across the country, he was Sarge. Samuel had served 22 years in the U.S. Army, most of them in places too hot, too loud, or too far away for the evening news to care about. He'd led patrols through jungles that swallowed sound, crossed deserts where even the air seemed to burn, and watched good men vanish in the space between one breath and the next. When he retired, the medals went into a shoebox. The uniform stayed in the back of the closet, wrapped in dry cleaner plastic. He never wore it again, not even to the funerals. Especially not to the funerals. But there was one promise he'd kept, one that brought him to the memorial every year without fail. Rain or shine, he stood before the same section of the wall, directly in front of a cluster of 7 names. No speeches, no camera crews, just white roses, one for each man who hadn't come home. Samuel had never missed a year. Not when his knees gave out. Not when his doctor told him the cold could kill him. And certainly not now, when the weather seemed determined to drive him away. The rain poured harder, running down his face in thin streams. Still, he stayed. Samuel's reason for being there wasn't complicated, but it was sacred. Each rose in his hand belonged to someone, and he knew their names as well as his own. Daniel Reese, Mark Kellerman, Luis Ortega, Peter Monroe, Chris Vance, Alan Jeffries, and Tom Adler. 7 men from his unit who had died on the same day, in the same place, under the same sky. He had been their sergeant, the one who gave the orders, the one they followed into the worst firefight of their lives. 6 had been gone within minutes. Tom had lasted until the medevac arrived, holding Samuel's wrist with a grip so tight it had left a faint scar. His last words were, "Don't let them forget us." That was the promise. That was why Samuel stood there, 32 years later, in the pouring rain with roses turning heavy in his hand. This wasn't about ceremony. It wasn't about patriotism as some polite concept. It was about keeping 7 men alive in the only way he still could, by remembering. But as the minutes ticked by and no one joined him, Samuel felt the familiar weight of being the last one left. The others from his unit were scattered, some gone, some too far away to make the trip. It didn't matter. He'd stand for all of them. He glanced at his watch. 11 more minutes until the time of the blast. 11 more minutes until he'd lay the roses down. 11 more minutes alone, or so he thought. The obstacle wasn't the rain, though it fell in sheets now, turning the street into a silver blur. It wasn't even his aching knees or the way his right hand had started to cramp from gripping the bouquet too tightly. The obstacle was something heavier, the quiet indifference of the world moving around him. A group of office workers hurried past, talking about lunch plans. One of them laughed loudly, and the sound felt strange against the solemn air Samuel carried. A city bus rolled by, its windows fogged, passengers staring out without seeing him at all. He shifted his weight, the cold settling deeper into his bones. Once years ago, a stranger had stopped to ask why he stood there every year. When Samuel told him, the man had simply nodded and said, "That's good of you." Then he'd walked away, never staying to listen to the rest. That was the way it usually went. A glance, a question, a polite exit. The roses drooped, heavy with rain. Samuel adjusted his cap and stared at the wall, each name blurring in the rivulets of water streaming down the granite. He was here for them, but a small, unspoken part of him wondered how much longer he'd be able to keep this up. How many more years, until even he couldn't stand here anymore? The thought lingered, and in that space, something began to shift. It started as nothing more than a faint vibration under the soles of his boots. Samuel almost missed it, the subtle rhythm beneath the rain. But then it grew clearer. Not thunder, not traffic, boots. His head turned slightly, scanning the rain-blurred edges of the street. Shapes began to form in the mist, dark, upright figures moving in perfect unison. The sound grew louder, the crisp, unhurried slap of leather on wet pavement, each step a note in a slow, deliberate drumbeat. Samuel's grip on the roses tightened. It couldn't be, not after all these years. Passers-by slowed, some even stopping under the awnings of nearby shops, watching as the line of figures approached. They were still too far to make out details, but their formation was unmistakable. Shoulders squared, heads aligned, every step identical. This was no casual march. The sound drew closer, the figures clearer now. Uniforms. Rain darkened, but unmistakable. Rows of them, moving as one. The people on the sidewalk seemed to hold their breath. Samuel didn't move. He didn't dare blink. He just stood there, bouquet trembling, as the formation closed the last stretch of the street. And then they stopped. Not in front of the wall, not beside the shops, but directly behind him. The leader stepped forward, a tall man with a shaved head and a chest full of ribbons, rain streaming down his face. He stopped just a pace behind Samuel, boots clicking together in a sharp salute. The rest of the formation followed suit in one flawless motion, a wall of silent respect standing in the downpour. Samuel didn't turn right away. He just stared at the wall, at the 7 names, his throat tightening. Then he heard the man's voice, steady, deep, carrying easily over the rain. "Sergeant Holt," he said, "we stand with you." Samuel's breath caught. He finally turned, his eyes sweeping over the faces, some young, some older, all wearing the same solemn expression. He didn't know them, not personally, but he knew exactly who they were. Soldiers. The leader continued, "You've been here alone for too many years. Not today." And then, without another word, the entire formation stepped forward, surrounding Samuel in a perfect arc. Each soldier carried a single white rose. In unison, they moved to the wall, placing the flowers one by one beneath the 7 names. For the first time in decades, Samuel felt the weight in his chest ease, just a little. The rain still fell, but he was no longer standing in alone. The rain plastered their uniforms to their bodies, darkening the fabric until it was almost black. Yet not a single soldier shifted or broke formation. Passers-by stood frozen under shop awnings, watching the strange and silent scene unfold. Some filmed, others simply stared, unable to look away. Samuel looked at the white roses now lying at the base of the wall. 7 from him. Dozens more from them. Each petal shimmered with rain, tiny droplets clinging like they refused to let go. His lips parted, but no words came. The tall man with the shaved head took a half step closer. "We read about you," he said quietly. "We heard you came every year." Some of us knew your men's names before we even got here today. His voice didn't waver. We're here because you kept your promise. Now let us help you keep it. Samuel felt a burn behind his eyes, the kind he usually swallowed down. But this was different. These weren't pitying glances from strangers. This was recognition, the kind that only came from those who'd carried the same weight. The leader turned to his soldiers. "Sound off," he commanded, and one by one, they spoke, each soldier calling out the name of one of Samuel's men, their voices firm, respectful, unhurried. The names rolled through the rain like a roll call from another time. Each one answered not by the dead, but by the living. Samuel's knees weakened slightly, and before he could stumble, two soldiers stepped forward, steadying him without a word. The moment the last name was spoken, the leader simply said, "You're not alone anymore, Sergeant." And for the first time in 32 years, Samuel believed it. The rain, heavy and unrelenting, began to take its toll. Samuel's breath came slower now, each inhale laced with the sting of cold air. The grip on his cane tightened as his legs trembled beneath him. He'd stood through far worse in his life, but this was different. He wasn't 20 anymore. One soldier noticed. "Sir, maybe you should sit," he said softly, offering an arm. Samuel shook his head. "Not until they have their roses." His voice was rough, stubborn, but quiet. Then, a sudden gust of wind slammed against the memorial, knocking over several bouquets. One of Samuel's roses rolled into a shallow puddle. He bent to retrieve it, but his knees buckled. Two soldiers caught him instantly, holding him upright. The crowd across the street gasped, some taking an uncertain step forward before stopping again. Samuel hated that moment, the feeling of his body betraying him in front of the very men and women who'd come to stand beside him. He clenched his jaw, willing strength back into his legs, but they refused to cooperate. "Sir," the tall leader said firmly, "you've stood long enough for them. Let us stand now." Reluctantly, Samuel allowed them to guide him to a bench just off to the side. His heart pounded as if protesting the surrender, and his gaze never left the wall. The rain blurred the names again, making them look almost as if they were moving, alive. In that moment, Samuel feared that this might be the last time he'd be able to stand here at all. The last time to fulfill the promise exactly as he'd always done. And that fear settled heavy in his chest. Heavier than the rain, heavier than the years. The formation didn't break when Samuel sat down. Instead, they tightened their arc around the memorial, creating a living shield between the wall and the rest of the world. The tall leader removed his own cap, letting the rain soak his shaved head, and placed it on the wet ground before the roses, a gesture older than most people realized, one that spoke of reverence more than any speech could. Then, without warning, one soldier began to hum. It was low at first, almost drowned by the rain, but the tune was unmistakable taps. Slowly, others joined in. No instruments, no ceremony, just human voices carrying the melody that had marked too many final farewells. The sound traveled across the square, soft but piercing, pulling in the bystanders who'd been hesitating under cover. One by one, people stepped out into the rain. A woman with a shopping bag, a man in a business suit, a teenage boy still clutching his skateboard. None of them spoke. They just stood in the downpour, heads bowed. When the last note faded into the storm, the leader turned towards Samuel. "Sir, permission to speak plainly?" Samuel managed a faint smile. "Always. You've carried this alone long enough," the man said. "But their memory, it's not just yours. It belongs to all of us now." The soldiers then moved in perfect unison, each placing a hand on the wet granite, palms flat against the names. Rainwater streamed between their fingers, running down over the carved letters as if the wall itself wept. For Samuel, the sight was almost too much to bear. For 32 years, he had been the one hand on that wall. Now there were dozens, and for the first time, the weight felt lighter. Samuel didn't realize he was crying until one of the soldiers quietly handed him a folded handkerchief. It was crisp, white, and embroidered with a unit insignia he didn't recognize. "Keep it," the soldier said simply. He wiped his face, but the tears returned as quickly as the rain replaced them. It wasn't grief this time, not entirely. It was something warmer, something that felt almost like relief. "You don't even know me," Samuel said, shaking his head slightly. A young woman in the front row answered, "Maybe not, but we know what you've done, and we know what it means to keep coming back when no one's watching." The tall leader nodded toward the bench. "Every year from now on, one of us will be here with you. Doesn't matter the weather. Doesn't matter if you can stand or not. You won't be alone again." Samuel swallowed hard. "That's a promise you shouldn't make lightly." "It's not light," the leader said. "It's heavy. That's why we're taking it from you." Something in Samuel's chest loosened at those words. For decades, the promise to not let them be forgotten had been his alone to bear. Now it was shared, and that sharing didn't diminish the promise, it strengthened it. When the soldiers finally stepped back, forming a wider circle to include Samuel, the bystanders instinctively moved in two, closing the space until the old sergeant was surrounded by a ring of people, uniforms and civilians alike. For the first time in years, Samuel didn't feel like a lone sentinel in the rain. He felt like part of a living, breathing unit again. And God, it felt good. Eventually, the leader called the formation to attention. The soldiers saluted the wall one final time, then turned towards Samuel. Each gave him a crisp salute, holding it just long enough to make sure he saw them. Not out of obligation, but out of choice. Samuel stood with effort, leaning heavily on his cane, and returned the salute. It wasn't textbook perfect. His arm shook slightly, his elbow didn't lock the way it used to. But every soldier there treated it like the sharpest salute they'd ever received. As they began to march away, Samuel called out, "Wait." His voice cracked, but it carried over the rain. The leader halted the line and turned back. "Thank you," Samuel said simply. "Not for being here, but for making sure they're here." He gestured toward the wall. The leader inclined his head. "Always, Sergeant." Then they were gone, their boots splashing rhythmically through the puddles until the sound faded into the distance. The civilians dispersed more slowly, some stopping to place their own flowers at the wall before leaving. Samuel remained a few minutes longer, alone again, but only physically. The square felt different now, charged with something that hadn't been there before. When he finally turned to go, the rain had lightened to a mist. He walked away without hurrying, the roses at the wall, the faces in his mind, and the promise, no longer his alone, steady in his heart. The next year, Samuel returned to the memorial on the same day, same time. The weather was merciless again, a bitter wind this time, slicing through his coat. But he wasn't worried. He knew. Sure enough, before the clock even struck the hour, the sound of boots echoed down the street. A smaller formation this time, but still precise, still purposeful. Among them was the tall leader from the year before, his shaved head catching the winter light. They formed up without a word, roses in hand, and Samuel felt that same easing in his chest. The crowd was larger too, civilians who'd heard the story, veterans who'd traveled from nearby towns. When the last rose touched the base of the wall, Samuel placed his hand on the granite. This time, a dozen others joined him immediately, palms flat against the cold stone. The warmth of shared remembrance cut through the wind. Years later, when Samuel was gone, the formation kept coming. Rain, snow, heat, it didn't matter. And in time, the tradition outgrew the soldiers. Families came. School children came. The wall was never left alone on that day again. People who passed through the square would sometimes ask why so many gathered in the weather. The answer was always the same. Because once there was a man who stood here alone, and now he never will again. The echo of that first day, boots in the rain, roses at the wall, heads bowed in silent unity, lived on long after the mist had cleared. And somewhere, if you listened closely, you could almost hear it still, the sound of a promise kept.